May I take this opportunity to welcome all you before presenting audit sampling. In this module, we're going to learn about methods that can be used to gather evidence by obtaining representative samples to transaction of balances. Obtaining representative balances of sampling for attributes, sampling, and substantive tests. Our plan is divided in big sections, starting by explaining why auditors use sampling and describe the two applications of audit sampling, then presenting steps for conducting attribute sampling for test of controls and substantive testing. Finally, explain how auditors evaluate the results of the test of substantive testing and test of controls. Why audit? Why sampling? The audit mission turns around obtaining sufficient and appropriate evidence regarding the assessed risk of material misstatement through designing and implementing appropriate response to those risks. These responses are based on sampling. Auditors usually do not test 100% of transactions or items in account balances because the cost of doing so would be so expensive. Also, auditors seek only for reasonable assurance. Auditors use sampling to test of controls to obtain evidence that internal control procedures are achieving the control objectives and applied as prescribed. To substantive tests to obtain evidence to support management assertion regarding account balances. What's the sampling? The sampling is the application of audit procedure to less than 100% of items with the population of audit relevance such that all sampling units have an equal chance to be selected so as to draw a conclusion about the entire population. Sampling can be applied on statistical or non-statistical methods. Whenever auditors make inference about the population based on a sample drawn from that population, they hope that the sample will be truly representative of the population. However, whenever a sample is selected, it may or may not be representative as we hope, so this is the sampling risk, which can be divided in two types of risk, alpha risk and beta risk. Auditors is very concerned about beta risk. Therefore, when deciding for an acceptable sampling risk for audit purposes, the focus on beta risk, not alpha risk, because he would not be motivated to do additional work and even decide the wrong decision. So, the use of the sampling method can affect the evaluation of risk of detection, which can be seen like this. It's the combination of sampling risk, non-sampling risk, and risk from other procedures. Non-sampling risk is the risk that the auditor reaches an erroneous conclusion for any reason not related to sampling. C'est le risque de non-prélèvement. So, attribute samples. In this talk, we will learn about how to use statistical sampling for test of controls using attribute sampling. For test of controls, sampling risk consists of the probability that the auditor will incorrectly assess control risk because the sample is not truly representative of the population. Attribute sampling. What's the attribute? It is the characteristic in which the auditor is interested and whether or not deviation from controls has occurred. For example, the existence of an authorization, signature, order, whatever. This test allows the auditor to select a number of documents that will support or refute control and preliminary control risk assessment through 5 major steps. Starting by defining our objectives, the auditor must have a defined question to be answered by the test. Auditors should record the objective of the test within the audit work papers. Not only does not help the reviewer, but also it clarifies the objectives for the auditor so that the proper audit procedure and sampling application can be defined. If the auditor can create a one-sentence question like those described above, the existence of signature, an order, etc., to be answered, he is less likely to perform an inappropriate procedure or use wrong sampling procedures. A clear understanding of what constitutes a deviation is too much important. Deviation needs to be defined in advance so that they can be recognized and treated consistently. Auditors must also fully understand the attributes being tested in order to know when a deviation occurs. Indeed, based on the auditor understanding of internal control, an auditor will be able to define the possible deviation or the exception condition. This will assist him when executing the procedure to properly identify control deficiency or instance of non-compliance. The auditor should determine the maximum rate of deviation from the prescribed control that he would be willing to accept without altering his planned assessed risk of control. This is the tolerable rate. In determining the tolerable rate, the auditor should consider two things: the planned assessed level of control risk and the degree of assurance desired by the audit evidence. If the auditor plans to assess control risk at a low level and he desires a high degree of assurance from audit evidence, he might decide that a tolerable rate of 5% or possibly less would be reasonable. By contrast, if the auditor plans to assess control at a higher level or he desires assurance from other test procedures, the auditor might decide that a tolerable rate of 10% or more is more reasonable. In assessing the tolerable rate of deviation, the auditor should consider that deviation would result in misstatement in the accounting records only if deviation and the misstatement occurred on the same transaction. In such situation, the risk of material misstatement for an assertion may be related to a combination of controls. Those controls should be treated as a single procedure to be tested, and deviation from any control in combination should be evaluated on that basis. The sufficiency of the audit is related to design and the size of the sample size, among other factors. The size of a sample necessary to provide sufficient and appropriate evidence depends on both objectives and the efficiency of the audit samples. Samples taken to test the operating effectiveness of control are intended to provide a basis for the auditors to conclude whether the controls are being applied as prescribed. To determine the numbers of items to be selected for a particular sample for a test of control, the auditor should consider the tolerable error rate, the expected population deviation rate, the sample risk, and the population size. An auditor applies also professional judgment to relate these factors in determining the appropriate sample size. The following exhibit shows the statistical sample that we can use to use all these factors in a statistical sampling approach with a 5% sampling risk. The table is developed using sampling distribution and also allow auditors to estimate the probability of representativeness of a sample. It depicts the sample size for a sampling risk set at 5%. The percentage figures down the left side is expected population deviation rate. By contrast, those on the top is the tolerable deviation rate. The numbers in the table are the sample size required for each combination of those factors. As you can see, you can take an example. For a tolerable rate of 7% and an expected population rate of 3%, the required sample size is 129. Also, auditor can apply professional judgment to readjust this determination. So, when we come up to the execution of the sampling test, the procedure of selecting items is too important. So, as the auditor should pay attention on which items to be chosen, on which method should be applied, and which population should we test. Also, he can apply each of these methods: random selection, systemic selection, or haphazard selection. So as you can see, these are the conditions and circumstances that the author should evaluate to decide which method should be applied. The results. The evaluation of results. The major step of an audit sampling. The result of the test will either support or refute the auditor's preliminary risk of assessment of control risk. The number of deviations found in the sample will help the auditor to decide whether the controls are reliable by inferring the proportion of the population that contains deviation. One way to evaluate the result of your test in a statistical context is to use a table like the one which will be shown where we compute the upper deviation rate, the upper error limit, the maximum error limit for a given sample increase, sample size, and a number of deviations found. The computed upper error limit is the statistical calculation that factors in sampling error and used to estimate the population deviation rate. The sample deviation rate, the actual sample deviation divided by the sample size may be lower or higher than the actual population deviation rate, that's the risk beta. Because auditors are mainly concerned with the risk of assessing control risk too low, the higher the upper limit is calculated to estimate how high the estimated population deviation rate might be. This table presented computed upper deviation rate, upper error limit as percentage, based on sample size and sample deviation rate, and the sampling risk as usual fixed at 5%. For example, using a sample risk of 5%, tolerable deviation rate, 7%, expected deviation rate, 2%, the previous statement shows to us that the required sample size is 88. So, if the auditor found one deviation, for example, what would be the upper error limit? So, as you can see, for one deviation found and 88, 90, the upper error limit is 3.3%. For two deviation found is 5.2%. For three, and etc. So, taking the example of the sample, applying the statistical evaluation method through supposing different numbers of deviation found in the population. As you can see, based on the table presented in the upper error limit, combination of sample size and sample deviation for one deviation found, comparing upper error limit to tolerable error limit, allows us to conclude that the auditor can support or refute the control. The same for two deviation found. By contrast, if the auditor found 3 deviation found, the upper error limit is 8.4%, is higher than the tolerable error limit. In this case, so the auditor will follow each deviation one by one and can increase the sample size and do more testing to see if the deviation persists or even maybe can conclude that the test does not support the preliminary assessed risk. Therefore, design substantive audit procedure accordingly. So we finished with test of controls. So let's start with substantive testing. Substantive procedure includes both analysis and test of details of balances. Analysis is not subject of sampling. So therefore, this topic on audit sampling for substantive testing, we focus only on test of details of account balances. In substantive testing, sampling risk refers to the probability that the auditor accepts an account balances based on the result of the sample when in fact the account is materially misstated. So the auditor tests whether or not the account balance is materially misstated, but how many dollars, dinar, any other currency constitute an error. This is where materiality enters in the audit sampling process. More specifically, the auditor considers tolerable misstatement, which is usually the same as overall materiality, determining tolerable misstatement is subject of the auditor's professional judgment, but in some cases the auditor may choose to systematically allocate materiality among balance sheet accounts. As you can see, these are the major steps for a substantive testing. When sampling a particular sample, the auditor should consider the specific audit objective to be achieved and should determine that the audit procedure or combination of procedure to be applied will achieve that objective. The auditor should determine that the population from which he draws the sample is appropriate for the specific audit objective. In other words, when sampling account balances, we are concerned about obtaining sufficient and appropriate evidence so that population will be coherent with objectives and the assertion to be verified. If the auditor has a risk of omitted items in account balances, he will not audit the account balance, but he will look away for other bases. In substantive testing, the auditor should focus on amounts, and because of materiality, the auditor will often segregate individually material amounts from other population units and test this amount to individually, and it won't be part of the sample. This is known as stratification, where the auditor has to consider professional judgment in stratifying population. The auditors can use statistical or non-statistical methods for sampling for substantive testing. If statistical sampling are chosen, the auditor must choose between a number of methods such as variable, monetary unit sampling. The most popular approach is monetary unit sampling. Simply state, must considers each individual dinar is in a population as a separate unit making up the account balance. If the auditor chooses a non-statistical sampling approach, only professional judgment is required. Similar to choosing the sample size for the test of control, determining the sample size for substantive testing is affected by a number of factors that apply to both statistical and non-statistical factors. In substantive testing, the sample risk is a function of an acceptable risk, inherent risk, and control risk, and the level of tolerable misstatement rate for a given account based on professional judgment. We are able to determine sample size based on this relationship described as above. So the number is this formula, the reliability factor that we are going to explain, divided by the tolerable error divided by the book value. So as you can see, these are the factors that affect the sample size, from tolerable misstatement to expectation, based on prior audit mission to the specification of the population and its variability. And finally, the reliability factor obtained by combining the required confidence level and expectation. So as we can see, through la loi de Poisson, for each required confidence level, starting by 70% confidence level to 99% confidence level, we can determine the reliability factor. And as a result, the sample size which guarantee for the auditor the assurance, the reasonable assurance to be given, the general use in audit sampling method is 95 confidence level, so the reliability factor will be 3. Sample items should be selected in such a way that the sample can be expected to be representative of the auditor perform the test and document the result of performance to support audit opinion. The auditor should project at the same occasion for each sampling test. The evaluation is the most important step. So, the auditor should project the misstatement result of the sample to items from which the sample was selected. There are several acceptable ways to project misstatement for the sample. These are one of the methods applied by CPA, and other accounting firms. For example, an auditor may have selected a sample of 550 items from a population containing 1,000 items. If he discovered an overstatement of 3,200 dinar in that sample, the auditor should project 600 dinar overstatement by dividing the amount of misstatement in the sample by the fraction of the total items from the population included in the sample. So this is something dinar. So this is the likely
3,000 is the mistake.
Yeah.
So this is the extrapolation from.
Yeah. So this is the likely mistake. In other words, the projected sample error. The auditor should add to this likely misstatement the misstatement discovered in any items examined 100% to obtain likely segregate misstatement. This total projected misstatement, the likely aggregate misstatement will be compared to materiality. And appropriate consideration should be given to the sampling risk. If the total projected misstatement is less than the total misstatement, the auditor should consider the risk that such a result might be obtained, even though the true monetary misstatement for the population exceeds total misstatement. On the other hand, if the total projected misstatement is close to the total misstatement, the auditor may conclude that there is an unacceptable high risk that the actual misstatement in the population exceeds the tolerable misstatement. This decision needs a very, very professional judgment. In addition to the evaluation of the frequency and amounts of any monetary misstatement, consideration should be given to qualitative aspects of misstatement. These include the nature, the causes of misstatements, such as whether there are differences in principles or in application, and errors can be caused by errors or frauds. The auditor should relate the evaluation of the sample to other relevant audit evidence when forming a conclusion about an account balance or class of transaction. But when evaluating the financial statement as a whole, projected misstatement result for all audit sampling application and all known misstatement from non-sampling application should be considered in the aggregate along with the other relevant audit evidence. If the sample result at any stage of the audit program suggests that the auditor's planning assumption was incorrect, auditor should take appropriate actions. The auditor should consider whether to modify the other audit tests that were designed.
10 minutes. That's it. Take a look.
Okay. Based inherent and control risk assessment. Thank you everybody for your concentration. But how about fraud?
Next time. Okay.
Thank you.